We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We've been digging into this chapter, right? And if you remember, if you've been here the past couple weeks, what we are in the middle of is Paul answering a question that the Corinthians had for him. And that question was presented to us in chapter 7, verse 1. And he said, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, all right? You've got some questions. You've got some things you'd like some clarity on. And the question is this: is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? And as Paul has been answering this question throughout this chapter, we've been learning that what he is answering is really a bit of a deeper question than just, is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? Because what lies underneath that question is ultimately, what does it mean to be spiritual, right? If we are followers of Jesus Christ and we are living our lives out within this world, in this context, in this culture, what does that mean and look like for us to be spiritual as we serve the Lord? And we've learned, even going back into chapter 6, that for some people in the Corinthian church, being spiritual to them, they were wrong on this, meant indulging yourself in sexual immorality, that they viewed their spirituality as a license to go and do all manner of things that God says is out of bounds. The question that they have then presented in the beginning of this chapter is another extreme, to say, well, if it's not good in some ways to have sexual relations outside of marriage, is it good then to avoid sexual relations inside of marriage? Perhaps that's the spiritual thing. The spiritual thing is to devote oneself solely to the Lord, and that may even involve saying no to your spouse, either in your sexual intimacy or even in your marriage altogether. And Paul has not minced words by saying that neither of those two extremes are appropriate. Instead, for those who are married, you ought to be committed to your marriage. You ought to be sexually active in your marriage. You've made a covenant to one another. And so stick to that covenant. Don't break the covenant promise that you've given. Then in the middle of our passage, or in this chapter, he brought in this weird idea of calling, right? However God has called you, remain in that calling. And so that's where we took this idea of what is it to be spiritual. And he applied that concept to those who are married. We dealt with that last week. Today, he's going to take that principle and apply it to those who aren't married. We're just going to say in these two bigger, broader categories, Paul says being spiritual to those who are married means staying in your marriage. We talked about that last week. This week, he's going to say or speak to those who are unmarried and bring his word of encouragement and opinion to them. Now, if you're in our passage today, starting in verse 25, Paul says, now concerning the betrothed. And now, our minds, when we read that, probably go to thinking about those who are engaged, because we think of that kind of commonality. In biblical days, you had a betrothal period that preceded marriage. In today's world, we think, well, you get engaged before marriage, so we equate those two. Now, depending on what translation you have, you might be seeing different wording in there, right? The ESV has betrothed, but some of you, as you look down, you might see Paul's writing saying, now concerning the virgins, right? So let's just define who we're talking about here and who Paul's addressing, because that's going to help us make sense of this passage a little bit. I think the best understanding of what Paul's getting at here is actually speaking not to those who have had no sexual activity and virgins as we tend to think of them, and probably not to those who are engaged to be married, but this is a term that would have been used also to communicate about those who were of marriageable age but were not yet married. All right, so you're thinking like you're young adults in kind of in that ballpark. And so that seems to make the most sense given our passage, and we'll talk about some other contexts here a little bit later on as well. So while Paul has talked to the married, today he's going to talk to the unmarried, and he's going to address at the beginning here specifically those who are of marriageable age but have not yet married. So he says, now concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord. Now, right there, some of us might start asking some questions. Like, what does this mean? He has no command from the Lord. If you remember last week, we saw in verses 10 and 11, he says, to the married, I give this charge. He says, not I, but the Lord. So this is a command from the Lord. That seems to carry more weight. So is Paul saying what he's about to share with us doesn't carry any weight to it at all? He's like, this is just my humble opinion. And so I think that's probably a misunderstanding, because he goes on and says, I give my judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. And so he understands that he's speaking here, recognizing that the Lord hasn't given a specific command to these people. He's like going back through the filters. He did the Google search, right, that went back through the scriptures and the teachings of Christ. And he's like, okay, Jesus didn't teach specifically about this group of people. So I'm going to give insight into it. I'm going to give my judgment as one who by God's mercy is deemed trustworthy. So he knows what he's sharing carries weight to it, but it's not something that the Lord has addressed specifically. And he'll say this. He says, verse 26, I think that in view of the present distress, it's good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. So here again, he's saying, as we'll reiterate from last week, are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. If you're married, be committed to your marriage. Invest in your marriage. Pursue your spouse. Stay in your marriage. Are you free from a wife? Don't seek out a wife. And he speaks of this in the context of the present distress. He's like, here's my judgment. Given this present distress, and we'll talk about what he might mean by that, it may be better for those who are unmarried to remain unmarried. That's his point here. And so he's using this idea, and in essence saying it may be preferable to remain unmarried. And so he digs into this, and he begins to teach on it in this present distress. And so we're going to say the first reason that Paul presents that it may be preferable for those who are unmarried to remain so is because it offers some freedoms from things. The first freedom is from present difficulties, right? So we're going to deal with this present distress that he's talking about. And generally, there are a couple different ways of understanding what he's meaning. The first, we're going to call it the circumstantial view. All right, maybe that sounds too formal, but we're just going to look at the circumstances. Now, historically, if you look back, there's a good chance that when Paul is writing this letter, he's writing it in the midst of a great famine that's going on in the land. And so it very well could be that when Paul says, given this present distress, given this great famine that's going on, it may be best for those who are unmarried to remain unmarried. And the fundamental question that he is posing there is, say, if you are unmarried and you want to consider getting married, number one, you might need to consider your circumstances. Okay, because there may be some present difficulties that may make it less than ideal to pursue a spouse at this time. Another view of it we'll call the eschatological view. All right, we're going to throw out the big theology terms just to keep everyone awake, because now you're thinking, wow, what are we dealing with here? So the eschatological view is the view that would pose that the present distress that Paul is referring to is this understanding of the imminent return of Christ. Eschatological, the end of things, right? And so some would argue that Paul is not speaking just to a famine, but that he understood that he's writing scripture that's going to apply for us today. And we're not living in the midst of a famine right now. And so how would we understand that? And that view would say that he perceived that Christ would be returning soon. And so given that Christ may return soon, it may be preferable for those who are single to remain unmarried. And the question he's asking you to consider, asking someone in this position to consider at this time is, given that, is marriage the wisest commitment of your time, your energy, your affection, and your resources here and now? Is it going to be the best decision for your devotion to the Lord? And either way you want to fall on this present distress, I think I can stand here with pretty good confidence and say, why not both? Why not both views? Right? Could it very well be that there is a famine going on in the land? Absolutely. But then down in verse 31, he also talks about the present form of this world passing away. And so could it be that there's both? There's a present distress by the circumstances, and there's this present distress that Christians are living in the last of days and that Christ may return at any moment, and we need to be responsible and intentional about the decisions that we make. Yes. Yes. And so the purpose in all of this that Paul is just saying is, hey, listen, for those who are unmarried, and I'd recognize, I said to Ben just a little bit ago, we're sitting in the sound booth, we're all singing, and I said, I'm going to go look out in this room, and I'm going to count all the people in our church right now who are unmarried. And I came back, and I'm like, it's not very many people, right? I look around the room right now, and most of you are married. And so the easy thing could be to say, I'm checked out, because this one's not for me. I had to listen last week. It's someone else's turn now. And I want to just challenge you for a second, because I'm going to guess that right downstairs right now, we have a lot of children. And those children are being raised by many of us younger people in our congregation. I also recognize that there is a good chance that we all know brothers and sisters in Christ who are unmarried, for whatever reason that may be. So we need to listen to what God's word says. And what Paul is saying is that for those who are unmarried, it may be a preferable thing to remain so, because it gives you a freedom from present difficulties. He's speaking pragmatically. Just on a practical level, it may be wise to not get married because there's difficulties that come with marriage. And now before you guys start giving amens and clapping, no one would do that here. He's just being real. Saying there are other things, and we're going to talk about some of those to come. There are difficulties that come with marriage. And he says, I would wish to spare you from those things. What's he dealing with? Well, one, many people believe Paul is probably a widower, that he had been married at some point previously in his life, and what he could be simply on the flat-out, realistic side of things saying is, you know what? There's a lot of difficulty in having to bury a spouse. There's a lot of sorrow, a lot of grief, a lot of pain. If I could spare you that, I would. Then he will talk about other difficulties as well. Difficulties like distractions, and that's this next freedom, right? So he says, I would wish to spare you of that, verse 28. We're going to come back to some of 28 in a little bit. And then 29, he says, this is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. And some of your Bible study red flags are starting to go up. And you're saying, wait a second. Didn't we just have this whole conversation about you need to be committed to your spouse and all this? And the first thing Paul says here is, this is what I mean. The appointed time is growing short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none. Do you mean that for those of you I'm looking around right now who are married, this is your ticket to say, hey, you should not be investing in your marriage. You should be living as if you didn't have a spouse. Paul said it. It's right there. It's in the text. To understand Paul that way would be a pretty gross misunderstanding of what he's getting at. Here's what I think Paul is communicating. He's saying the time is short. Whether that's the time of the end of this famine, it can't go on forever. Whether it's the time before Christ returns, the time's short. And what's imperative is that God's people live without distractions in life. Okay, so he says, number one, remaining single may be profitable or preferable because it offers a freedom from present difficulties, and it offers a freedom from some potential distractions. Okay, some of you now are like, yeah, I know the distractions. I got a great marriage, and we invest a lot of time in our marriage. We have a lot of commitments together. And you know that with a marriage and a family comes, I've learned this the hard way. I should probably check with someone before I make plans, because I've made plans that I should not have made. And Paul is simply saying, guys, listen, there is a potential for distractions that come with family. They're not bad. They're good things. The scriptures are very positive about family. The scriptures are very positive on marriage. But Paul is saying, listen, if right now you were an unmarried person when you came to faith in Christ, it may be preferable for you to stay so. Because, number one, your spouse is not an excuse to not serve the Lord. You cannot stand before God someday and say, I did not serve you. I did not engage in the mission and the ministry of your church and your kingdom because I had a spouse. God's going to call foul. Live as if you had none. No distraction. He uses mourning and grief and celebration and rejoicing. He uses resources. He's like, listen, you are not to, as God's people, become consumed with the circumstances that you are in. You are not to be distracted by even the griefs that come. There's a time to mourn and a time to rejoice. Ecclesiastes, we get that. But your grieving is not an excuse to not serve the Lord. Your rejoicing is not an excuse not to serve the Lord. He is saying, listen, we ought to be devoted to the things that God has called us to. Your spouse should help you in that ministry. And simply what Paul is getting at is, for those who are unmarried, there is a freedom from some potential distractions in life. Your number one business is to serve and honor God. And so he will go on down into verse 32, and he will say, I want you to be free from anxieties. And now, these anxieties, we think of them just as worries. And at men's retreat this year, we talked about worry. And there's an interesting etymology that comes under this word anxieties and worry. And the picture of it is literally those things that are pulling you apart. Okay, so if you picture someone standing over here, and they've got a rope tied to this hand, someone's over here, and they got a rope to this one. These anxieties are the things that are pulling you in two different directions. That's what he's saying. They're not bad, they're just divided. Your attentions, your energies, your efforts are divided. And he says, I want to free you from these anxieties. These things are going to pull you in different directions. And he will go on then to the unmarried man. We'll come back to that actually in a second. Let's jump down to verse 36. Why would he say all of these things? He says them, verse 36, for their benefit. This isn't a message from Paul to say, hey, to you married people, you're stuck in your marriage and you just got to deal with it. You're some sub-tier Christian because you have attentions that are divided. He says, I write these things to your benefit, speaking to those who are unmarried, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Your undivided devotion to the Lord. So here's the third. Remaining unmarried, for some, may be preferable because it offers a freedom for primary devotion. Primary devotion. I understand, our primary devotion is to God. But what Paul is saying here is that, listen, you are sold to the Lord. If you think of it this way, and not to step into the toes or the realm of our Catholic brothers and sisters, but in some ways, Paul is saying if you're not married to a spouse, you have an opportunity to be married to the ministry of God's church. So here's kind of the example that will maybe help make this make sense. For those of you who are vehicle kind of people, I know we've got vehicle people in the church. All right? What Paul is saying is there's a difference between a motorcycle and a semi-truck. That seems to make sense in the world that we live in, because you can drive down the highway, and what do you see happening? You see, well, probably not today. It's a little chilly outside. But you'll see motorcycles that have some different agility to navigate through traffic, and don't abuse that for those who are motorcycle people in the room. But there's agility that can say, okay, a motorcycle has an opportunity and freedom to make quicker moves than a semi-truck does. A semi-truck, you may be driving down the road, and for that semi-truck to make the same turnaround, it's going to take a lot more space, a lot more time, a lot more coordination, a lot more awareness of other things that are going on in life. And what Paul is simply saying is, when it comes down to it, the unmarried person is in the kingdom mindset more like that motorcycle. You have a freedom to be able to go and move and do things. For example, I would not be able to take a call to go to India right now as a missionary without having to consider my family. Does that make sense? Meanwhile, somebody who is unmarried may be able to answer that call and leave rather quickly because they're not concerned about others. And as your family grows, the vehicle grows. That's what Paul's getting at here. It's not a freedom to serve God. It's a freedom in some ways of availability to do things. And so what we are getting at, when I talk about primary devotion, Ben, you can throw number 3 up there. When we're talking about primary devotion, I am not saying to those of us who are married in this room that your primary devotion is not the Lord. It is. God's number one. He's your number one business. He's your number one priority. What I am saying by primary devotion is that for those who are unmarried, the kingdom mindset says you have a responsibility. May even go that far. You have a responsibility to be showing up in some ways, those are your brothers and sisters who are married, because you have time and availability that they may not exactly have. The world's counsel oftentimes to those who are unmarried is you have a freedom to do your thing. You get to do life the way you want to do life. You can make decisions and do the things that you want to do. To the young people, the world will say, live it up for a little while before you have responsibilities. But the kingdom mindset says you have responsibilities, and it's to the Lord. It is to please Him. Now let's go back. The unmarried man, this is the end of verse 32. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. So Paul's argument has been made that there is a place where remaining unmarried very well may be a preferable decision. In today's church, let's be honest, I think we look at this issue differently than the Corinthians did. Because they are looking at the unmarried life as if to say it's more spiritual. Is it good? 7:1. Whereas in the church today, we have a way of looking down on those who aren't married. We have a way of saying, oh, you're not married yet. And in our hearts, we may never say it with our mouths, but in our hearts at times we think, I wonder why. I wonder if something's wrong. Why haven't they married? That's the right thing to do. That's the step in life you ought to take. And Paul is pumping the brakes. He's saying, listen, marriage is good. You're no more or less spiritual if you're married. Remaining unmarried is good. You're no more or less spiritual if you're unmarried. Wherever you are, you serve the Lord. And you serve Him faithfully. So at the end of the day, this is not a command from Paul. Because the last thing he says, there is a freedom to make a personal decision. There's a freedom to make a personal decision. So if anyone thinks that he's not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry. It's no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity, but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. Get married? Great. Stay unmarried? Great. You have a choice that you can make. Going back up earlier in verse 28, but if you do marry, you've not sinned. If a betrothed woman marries, she's not sinned, yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, right? So he's saying, you're not sinning if you choose to get married. He's not saying, for those who are unmarried, don't ever think about getting married. Stay single. He simply says there's a choice to be made, and both choices in the eyes of God are fine. No one is any more or less spiritual because of it. So how do you make the decision? And for those of you who have kids, for those of you who have friends, these are helpful ways to help have that conversation. How do you make the decision if it is good and right to go ahead and pursue marriage at this time? And I would say, number one, consider your circumstances. How would you consider your circumstances? A couple of things. Number one, your character. Are you the kind of person that someone would want to marry? Are you walking faithfully before the Lord? Are you that right kind of person? Or do you have areas in your life where you need to address and grow and see some progress? Two, your career. Are you in a place where you can support a spouse? There are worldly things that come with this, Paul says. Just let's be practical. You're going to have to support someone. If there's a famine going on, that gives it all the more weight. Are you in a place where you can support taking on someone else? Children. In today's day and age, there's a lot more instances where taking kids into account may need to be a necessary thing, especially for those who may be widowed or widowers. Is it good, given where your kids are at, to pursue marriage here and now? What about compatibility? In our passage at the end, in verse 39, Paul says, "A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord." So the question that we should be asking, and asking of even of young people, is: if you're looking for a spouse, are you looking for someone in which you have spiritual compatibility? Someone who shares your faith. Paul says there is a freedom to remarry for those whose spouses have died, but to be done in the Lord. To be done in the Lord. There's compatibility. Next, consider your calling. Consider your calling in life. I have run into stories in the past couple weeks in studying this of men and women who have taken a call to the mission field. Right? Maybe gone and done great things on the mission field, but consider a man who went over to, let's say, India to serve God in the mission field, and he has a wife and children that he left home here in America. They go and serve, and they did great things in the mission field, but what happens to the family at home? A marriage that ends in divorce. Kids who have no father. So I say consider your calling, because you need to consider those who are around you. And for those who are unmarried, if you are feeling called to the mission field, that may be something to talk about. Is it good and right to pursue a marriage here and now? Calling, some may have a very clear calling from the Lord that he's called into a life of singleness. That's okay. My great aunt is someone who God has called to a life of singleness. She served the Lord in Pakistan for years of her life as a missionary. And she is totally content with the life that God has called her to. God has called people to that. And that's okay. Consider your calling in the Lord. What Paul provides here as an opportunity is an area where there may be burning for a marriage. If you go back earlier in our passage, in this chapter to verse 8, to the unmarried and the widows, Paul says, "I say that it's good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion." Well, John Calvin talks about this burning with passion as an inner turmoil, right? And he will use the example. He says there's a difference. Let's say it was a little bit of a different day outside and we were sitting around a campfire. He says there's a difference between sitting near a campfire and feeling the warmth of the fire and being consumed by that fire. There's a difference in feeling the heat and being consumed by it. And that's what he's talking about here. And so he speaks of this burning with passion, this desire for a relationship is something that becomes consuming. And so when asking, is it right to remarry, there may be a time in which that burning is so strong that Paul says you are better off to marry than to remain single, because you're going to be useless if you are being constantly consumed by the longing for that relationship, that longing for a marriage that comes. In that case, Paul says, go remarry. There's no sin in what's happening. We see that reiterated in verse 36 through 38. So at the end of the day, as Paul wraps this answer up, as he answers their question, is it good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman? His answer can be summed up as this: your relationship status doesn't make you any more or less spiritual. Your relationship status doesn't make you any more or less spiritual. Being married is good. Being unmarried is good. So at the end of the day, choose your good. And if you're married, find and make the good in your marriage. If you're unmarried and you commit to that good, find the good in serving God in great ways in your being unmarried. Both are good, totally good and valid options. So those who are married shouldn't look down on others and say there's something wrong with you or any less spiritual because you aren't married. Those who are unmarried shouldn't poke fun at their married brothers and sisters saying, ha ha, I have a greater freedom than you do. We all have been called to a role to serve God in greater ways. So one is not more spiritual than the other. So serve God where you are called. That's Paul's answer to their question.